have Rebecca Wilcomerson who will make the initial introduction.
Thank you for your patience as we dealt with some technical difficulties. I am very proud to be able to welcome you on behalf of Jews Against Islamophobia, which is a coalition of Jews Say No, Jewish Voice for Peace, and Jews for Racial and Economic Justice. As the name implies, we're a coalition of groups and individuals who are committed to fighting Islamophobia in New York and beyond. And as part of that, we really think it's important to understand the roots of Islamophobia and how it interacts with other systems and with the American political scene. So to that end, we're doing a series of events that we're really excited about. This is the first one, Islamophobia, Empire, and U.S. Politics. And we have a really wonderful group of panelists who are going to speak to you tonight. And I'm just going to introduce Abdeen Jabaro, who's our moderator, and he'll introduce the rest of the panelists. Abdeen is one of the most renowned lawyers on civil rights issues practicing today. I am going to highlight a few things almost at random from his very extensive bio, because it's hard to choose from all the incredible things that he has done. But he's a founder and past president of the Association of Arab American University Graduates. During the mid-1970s, he was instrumental in exposing the Nixon administration's Operation Boulder program against Arabs and Arab Americans. And he was directly under surveillance and harassment, and in 1985 won a long legal battle which forced the FBI to destroy the records it maintained concerning his exercise of activities protected by the First Amendment. He's also been an active member of the executive committee of the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee since its founding in 1980. He served as its president and is still active today. And he's just been he's an incredible resource and treasure for us in the community as a real expert in civil rights and an incredible world presence. So,
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for coming this evening, and thank you, Jews Against Islamophobia. They have brought an enormous amount of energy and enthusiasm to an almost impossible task. There are demonstrations, research and writing projects, forums, and have involved dozens and dozens of people. But there's one person that I feel is incumbent upon me to single out, if you will allow me to. And that is Donna Neville. Her leadership in this effort has been really extraordinary. Now, the topic of Islamophobia is a very involved one because it has many different sources. Prior to 9/11, it really was not called Islamophobia, although that's really what it was. After the June 1967 war in the Middle East, and particularly after the 1973 Arab-Israeli war involving the Arab boycott on oil, there began a massive campaign in Hollywood to depict Arabs, and they were called Arabs at that time, either as what we call billionaires, belly dancers, or bombers. And there was a spate of movies that came out that were kind of cowboys and Arabs movies. They were the same genre as the cowboy and Indian movies that I was raised on as a kid, that really basically manifested the kind of deep-seated racism which this country was basically founded upon. And this phenomenon was one that I encountered when I left my law practice in Detroit, Michigan in 1986 and moved to Washington to head up ADC. Our West Coast regional director, Alex Oda, had been assassinated by a bomb in his office as he opened the door. Two of our offices had been firebombed, and this incredible deluge of anti-Arab sentiment led politicians to refuse contributions from even Jim Aberriz, who was the founder of our organization, sent a $100 check to one of the Kennedys, and it was returned to him. Only later did he apologize for that. But there was an ADC, the organization that I headed, was established because of the Operation Abscam. Now, I don't know if many of you may not have heard of Abscam, but Abscam was an FBI operation in which they dressed up an Italian-American FBI agent to look like an Arab, wearing a kafia and a gal, the Arabic headdress, and who offered money to certain corrupt congressmen in return for some immigration assistance. And Abscam, the title Abscam was a conjugation of Abdul Scam. And when Jim Aberriz went to the then head of the FBI, William Webster, and asked him, why was it that you chose an Arab to be the subject for this sting operation? And Webster's response was, we needed someone who would be a credible subject. So that was really kind of what started the ADC into operation. Now I want to, and I can mention the names of these movies. I have a list of them here, but you can go to read Jack Shaheen's books, Real Bad Arabs, and other subjects on this matter. But I want to fast forward to 9/11, because after 9/11 we see a quantitative and qualitative change in this. Instead of Arabs, it became Muslims. But in essence, it was really an extension of what had happened prior to 9/11. And I think we can refer to none other than Zbigniew Brzezinski when he said that the term war on terror was intended to generate a culture of fear, deliberately, because it, quote, obscures reason, intensifies emotion, and makes it easier for demagogic politicians to mobilize the public on behalf of the policies that they want to pursue. That is clearly exactly what happened. The politics of fear were engendered and developed by the Bush administration, and this allowed for a climate in which numerous groups, non-governmental groups, interest groups, could operate, including the neocons, which played an enormous part in this operation of expanding Islamophobia. Some of you may have heard of Ayaan Hirsi Ali. She is, I believe, a Dutch national, and she was originally of Somali origin. She gained her admission into Holland through fraudulent means, and then became a very big ally of Theo van Gogh in promoting very sharp and distinct anti-Muslim movements in Europe. And then where did she come? She came to the United States after she left there. And who brought her here? The American Enterprise Institute. And where did she land up? She landed here at NYU. And she's written a book, and she's traveling around the country, and she's being published in the Smithsonian Magazine and all over. And all of this is designed to reach a particular segment of the American public, not the hard hats that they organize to go down and hold up signs at Park 51, but the more educated elements. And so there's a massive, well-funded operation afoot. Now, how did I come to really get interested in this whole Islamophobia operation? I used to walk along the East River down to the Fulton, what used to be the Fulton Fish Market. And I picked up a copy of the downtown newspaper.
Downtown Express.
Downtown Express. And on the cover was this photograph, it was at the time of Park 51, was a cover of these demonstrators that were holding up these placards with red lettering, all neatly printed in some print factory, that said Sharia in them, in red lettering, dripping in blood. Now, I know that those hard hats that were carrying those signs didn't have the faintest idea what Sharia was about. And I wondered then, what is it that is behind this whole movement? And as I began to study it, I understood that there was a very concerted effort afoot to make this war of terror unlike the feeling that we had in this country about communism. We know that after the Second World War, the Truman administration embarked on a policy of the Cold War, and that fear was an important part of that. And to this day, the numbers of people who still refer to communism as being a great factor of to be feared has not diminished considerably. And we now know that this whole issue about Islamophobia, it will take years for it to really be eradicated in this country. Now we have 4 people here tonight. I'm not here to give a lecture, but we have 4 people who are experts on this subject, either because of their academic study or because of their involvement in the community. Deepa Kumar is Associate Professor of Media Studies and Middle Eastern Studies at Rutgers University. And what's important, I think, is that she has a anti-colonial interest. I think that one has to understand this in terms of the whole history of imperialism and colonialism, and she has brought that perspective to this issue. She's a much sought after public speaker and has spoken at dozens of university and community forums on a range of topics. So without further ado, I would like to ask if you will begin, Deepa, with your presentation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Abdeen. So as Abdeen said earlier, part of what I'm going to be focusing on is the argument that Islamophobia, that is the ideology of anti-Muslim racism, is intrinsically connected to the project of empire. But I want to actually begin by making an observation. On the left, I believe that we still have a rather shallow, and by left I mean the liberal, far left, the entire wing. I think we still have a rather shallow understanding of what Islamophobia is, where it comes from, how it operates, and so forth. And I say still because I've been talking, organizing, and writing about this topic now for a little over a decade, at least since the events of 9/11. And what I find is that we still have a rather steep learning curve around this question. Let me give you the most recent example of this. And I say this not to put people down, but just to say that we still have a lot of work to do in terms of learning where this form of racism comes from so that we can more effectively fight it. So I was doing an interview, a radio interview, and I was talking to the host before the interview actually started and saying, I'd like to make a few comments on the recent presidential debate on foreign policy. And so can you include that in your questions and so forth? And she says, why? what does foreign policy have to do with Islamophobia? Which it's like I didn't have the 45 minutes I needed to explain it. And so I just said, well, it has everything to do with it. So why don't you ask me a question and we'll see what we can do around that. But I think what happens is that a lot of the time, people, good intentional people, liberals, leftists, and so on, think that Islamophobia is just about hate crimes, right? It is about the kind of atrocious things that have been done to Muslims in this country, or people who quote unquote look Muslim. And here I'm talking about, of course, the 6 Sikh Americans who were gunned down only this past summer because they look Muslim. And of course, we've seen an atrocious increase in the amount of hate crimes against Muslims. But what I want to argue is that this form of ideology is actually far more systematic and systemic, and we shouldn't mistake just the actions of the far right, the Islamophobic network that Abdeen was talking about, which, make no mistake about it, these people are extraordinarily well funded. They get money to the tune of tens of millions of dollars, which Ellie and Donna have documented really well, so I won't say anything more about them. This network does exist. They are vicious. They are people we should fight back against. But the fact of the matter is that Islamophobia is far deeper than that. And if I get a chance, I'm going to talk about liberal Islamophobia, but if not, people can possibly bring it up in discussion. But the point of the matter is that we need to look at structures, we need to look at systems, and see how this ideology helps to justify a whole range of policies, both in the United States as well as abroad, and to challenge ourselves to think in this deeper and more systematic fashion. And I think it's like the way we think about anti-black racism, right? We understand that the origins of racism comes from the bowels of slavery, and then later the conquest and colonization of Africa. It's not simply the product of the Ku Klux Klan. And I think we have to have the same sort of approach and the same sort of attitude when it comes to Islamophobia. So in the book, I argue that the Muslim enemy has been used by the elites in the West to advance political projects, and in particular the project of empire. So the first thing I want to underscore is that this is not about religion. This is about politics, and it's at that level that we must both understand it and fight it. So the Crusades, for instance, is the first moment in European history when this image of the pernicious Muslim enemy comes into being. But if you step back for a second and you look at this call for holy war, right? I mean, it's about going and rescuing the Christians in Jerusalem from these horrible barbaric Muslims and so on and so forth. All sorts of apocryphal stories are told about why Christians should come together and go off and fight this holy war and so forth. But you step back for a second and what you see are the machinations of a particularly radical band of people who had come to take over the Vatican, and whose agenda was to create a unified Christian Europe over which they could have spiritual authority, right? And you look at Pope Urban II and some of his statements, he says, so far brothers have been fighting each other in Europe, now we need to come together. So that's one part of the process, is creating a united Christian Europe over which the papacy could hold authority, but also extending the influence of the Vatican into the Byzantine Middle East. And so this has always been about politics, but the language of religion and the language of holy war gets used to recruit people and gets used to mobilize these sorts of wars. But I want to say, though, that even when we had this image of Muslims in the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries, that was not the only image. Because in Al-Andalus, which is the name given to Muslim rule in the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, Portugal, and so on, when Christians and Jews came into actual contact with Muslims, they had completely different views, right? Because ideology works best when you don't have anything in reality to contradict that ideology. And of course, once that ideology gets contradicted by real life, people's ideas change accordingly. And so what you see in Al-Andalus is basically an 800-year period where Muslim rule leads to the most amazing advancements in medicine, astronomy, architecture, and so on and so forth, and the bringing together of Christians, Muslims, and Jews to create and foment this kind of knowledge. And so needless to say, there is a lot more mutual respect and tolerance between these various groups. And the other point is that by the time we come to the Renaissance, the 14th century, 15th century, the image of the Muslim enemy has pretty much ceased to exist. the Vatican is no longer powerful, and we're entering a new era, one in which, by the way, the Ottoman Empire is respected, the Ottomans are seen as Europeans of a sort, and so on and so forth. So I've taken some time to lay that history out because I want to argue against this notion of clash of civilization and the belief that somehow the East and the West have always been at war with each other. That's not true. Typically, these ideas are mobilized by the elite at particular moments to justify a political agenda. Now, coming up to the 19th century, this is where the work of Edward Said, and particularly his book Orientalism, is extremely useful. He was one of the first people who advanced the idea that with the advent of European colonization of North Africa, of the Middle East, and so on, a systematic body of ideas called Orientalism comes into being, whose key function is to justify this process of colonization. Now, I want to fast forward to the era of the war on terror and the context in which we currently live, in order to sort of draw the continuity as well as the discontinuity between earlier Muslim enemy images. Yet again, after 9/11, the idea of the Muslim enemy gets mobilized because it's useful to US imperialism. It's useful in terms of justifying the war in Iraq, in Afghanistan, drone warfare, ramped up surveillance, and a whole host of other policies that now become a sort of war on terror mentality, which is mobilized on the basis of fear, as Abdeen mentioned earlier, of the Islamic terrorist. And so one caveat, though, is that the ideology of Islamophobia actually looks different at different moments. There are similarities, of course, but while the content is different, the function remains pretty much the same through history. So a little bit on the clash of civilizations. This term was first coined by Bernard Lewis, who is an Orientalist scholar. He used to work in the UK, found that the axis of power was shifting across the Atlantic to the United States in the post-World War II era, moved over, took a job at Princeton University, wrote a famous, or I should say infamous piece called The Roots of Muslim Rage in the Atlantic back in 1990, and coined this term called the clash of civilizations. And of course, it was for the political scientist Samuel Huntington to then take up this term, run with it. He first publishes an essay and then a book and so on. In a nutshell, the argument is this. Huntington argues that in the post-Cold War period, conflict is no longer going to be political, it's going to be cultural. Why? Because he divides the world into about 7 or 8 civilizations, each of which he says has its own unique culture, its own unique past, and because every culture and civilization is so different, they are inevitably going to clash with one another. And so for him, the West is going to be threatened most severely by the Islamic and the Confucian civilization, and actually he sees a sort of collusion between these two forces to overturn the West. And so what this is, if you actually sort of read more thoroughly this idea of clash of civilizations, which by the way becomes dominant after 9/11, so much so that even sections of the liberal left have come to accept these ideas and perpetuate a form of liberal Islamophobia. But if you look at what is at root in this clash of civilizations formulation, it's nothing other than the white man's burden, right? This is a term that comes from Rudyard Kipling, the British poet. He wrote a poem called The White Man's Burden, in which he argues that it was the burden of the civilized European West to go off and colonize and bring civilization to what he called the half-devil, half-child colonized person, right? And you think of that formulation, half-devil, half-child. So on the one hand, it is people that we should be really, really scared of because they are demonic, they are devilish, we cannot understand them, we cannot reason with them, they must be vanquished. On the other hand, half-child, not quite fully grown and therefore in need of our parentalism, our tutelage, and so on and so forth. And what you see today, really, I've sort of reworked this formulation. What we have today is the half-terrorist, half-victim. And there's a gender dynamic to this. On the one hand, you have the half-terrorist being the Islamic terrorist, the male terrorist, who, of course, is again irrational, demonic, cannot be reasoned with, and simply blindly follows the teachings of a violent religion to kill himself and everybody else around him. And of course, it's this fear that justifies not only the wars that I mentioned earlier, but also drone strikes. I think Madiha is going to talk maybe about the drone strikes, but under the Obama administration, we've seen a 5-fold increase in the number of drone strikes that from the previous Bush term. And this happens without us knowing, because you know, a war is something we cover, our news media covers on a day-to-day basis. Drone strikes pretty much go under the radar screen. We don't pay attention to them, and yet they cause you know, enormous amounts, not just of death, but of trauma and so forth. And so this has been, the fear generated against this image of the Islamic terrorist has been used to justify a whole host of such policies. But I do think we should look at the other side of that equation, which is half victim. And typically it's women who are presented as half victims, right? Muslim women who are irredeemably oppressed, who apparently cannot organize on their own behalf, who are not agents, but who must have white men on horses with their jodhpurs and pith helmets rushing off to go and swoop them up and rescue them from other brown men. And of course, this is not new. This obsession, the European obsession with brown women, starts in the 19th century. You know, in all sorts of ways. I don't have the time. I'm being asked to wrap up fairly soon. But there's just one example, which is the painter Jerome actually has this painting called the Harem Baths, which, you think about it, he would never have been allowed into a harem. And so it's the projection of his fantasies onto what might be happening in the harem baths. And therefore the idea, so there's a half titillation, half rescue narrative going on, which I don't have the time to talk about. But suffice it to say that the idea that white men should go off and rescue Muslim women is, of course, the narrative that was used in Afghanistan. Never mind, of course, that feminist organizations like Rawa said, no, don't bomb us, don't come here, we're perfectly capable of liberating ourselves. So I'll come to a close with this, and that is that this demonization, the systematic demonization of Muslims, anti-Muslim racism, is not a coincidence. It's not simply a product of bad ideas in our head or simply a product of the far right. It's rooted in US foreign policy and US politics. And it's therefore useful and important to talk about the religion Islam, to talk about its tenets, to talk about the way in which regular people practice this religion. But at the same time, we have to talk about its uses on the political stage. And I'll end with one last example. Back in the post-Second World War, during the Second World War, after the events of Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans, as I'm sure you all know, were interned in these awful camps, and the camps were horrendous, by the way, and young, old, everyone was thrown in there. Now, full 4 decades later, under the Reagan administration, an apology was issued, and some people have drawn the conclusion that this is because Japanese Americans integrated themselves into American society and were patriotic, excellent citizens, etc., etc. Well, nothing wrong with being good citizens, nothing wrong with getting a job and so on. But the fact of the matter is that this apology could be issued only at a point when Japan had ceased to be a threat to the United States politically around the globe. And it's not a coincidence that at the same time that this is happening in relation to the Japanese, the Chinese are now being seen as a huge threat. The neocons actually start to focus on the Chinese as well in the 1990s, and the anti-Chinese racism comes into being in a much more systematic fashion in that form. And so as long as oil continues to be important, not so much for domestic consumption in the United States, but in terms of a world energy resource, this kind of ideology is going to be used to justify control over that region and to control oil resources. So we have to fight this at the personal level, we have to fight this at the ideological level, but we have to always, I think, root it within a political analysis of where this form of racism comes from. Thanks.
The second speaker this evening will be Madiha Tahir, who's an independent journalist reporting on the conflict, culture and politics in Pakistan. She's co-editor of the recently published Dispatches from Pakistan. She's reported on everything from the Baluch separatist movement to the role of Islamist organization in Pakistani politics. And now, drones. Most recently, she has been interviewing drone survivors and effectees in this travel to the tribal areas. Her work has appeared in a host of outlets, including Foreign Affairs, Democracy Now! And the BBC. Nabiha?
Yes, thank you. Just start my timer. I wanted to start with a little anecdote. About a month ago, I pulled my back, and actually I had to hobble up to health services, and I couldn't stand straight at all. I was bent over like a pretzel, and it's something that had never happened to me before. And I was waiting in the examining room, and the doctor came in, just lovely, gentle, generous-looking woman. And she asked me, she said, "How much pain are you in?" And she said, tell me how much pain are you in, from a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most, right? And I'm completely sort of bent over, and I'm starting to think, like, what should my response be? I mean, I suppose 10 is the potential for the utmost pain, so I would probably be screaming. I'm not screaming, so it's not 10. But I want medication because I'm bent over. And is there a cutoff? Like, if I say less than 5, am I not going to get any medication? And so I need to say maybe more than 5. The reason I bring this up is because it occurs to me that international law actually works in quite the same way. It decides how much pain is enough pain or too much pain before one is moved to help, right? So certain forms of pain is collateral damage. Other forms of pain becomes after a certain point, and we don't know what that tipping point exactly is, becomes massacre, becomes genocide. And all of this stuff, particularly around the drone strikes in Pakistan, relies very much on numbers, in particular on percentages, right? How many civilians have we killed today? How many militants have we killed today? The range of debates around drone strikes in Pakistan has to do with numbers. And percentages in particular, excuse me. And percentages are kind of an interesting thing. They have a way of making life quite invisible in this context. They have a way of sort of baking racism in its peculiar form, Islamophobia, into the law. And I want to talk about this because we tend to think of numbers as something that's transparent, that has to do with fact, and we like to use it. I mean, the right wing is going to do what the right wing is going to do. I'm sort of a bit more interested in the sort of liberal arguments and the arguments that use humanitarian law and international law to speak about this stuff. So let me explain what I mean about numbers a little bit. The best place to start in that, I think, is not Pakistan, but Harlem and other African American neighborhoods. So for instance, we had the tragic death of Trayvon Martin. George Zimmerman murdered this teen, Trayvon Martin, and he claimed that Trayvon looked suspicious. And the Florida cops tried to cover up on behalf of Zimmerman. You have Sean Bell, who was murdered in Queens when the NYPD claimed that he looked suspicious, and he was shot 50 times a day before his wedding. Illinois cops murdered Stevan Watts because they claimed that this kid was dangerous. He was a kid who had Asperger's syndrome. And so here in America, we have Trayvon Martin, we have Sean Bell, we have Stevan Watts. And in Pakistan, we have Zahinullah, who's a teenager who was killed on New Year's Eve 2009 because the American state claimed that there were some militants who happened to be staying as guests in his home. We don't know whether that's true. We have Naimullah, age 10 or age 11, killed in 2010. We have Sayed Wali Shah, age 7. And the list goes on. In total, I think, so far, we've identified about 176 children. That doesn't mean that there aren't more. That's just the number we've identified. So now when the cops in the United States kill in this manner, we don't make the following argument. We don't say, for example, well, the cops have only killed 0.02% of the innocent African American population, so it's morally okay. No one with any sense would say that. No one except those who have a racist sensibility. But this is exactly what's happening in Pakistan. So, for example, Scott Shane, who's a reporter reporting for that paper of moral rectitude, the New York Times, in an article called The Moral Case for Drones, says the following. Scott's sort of case, his moral case for drones is that at most, 20% of the people killed in the tribal areas in Pakistan are civilians. That's his moral case for drones. So let's think about this. When Trayvon Martin is killed, we, and by we I mean us liberals, us readers of the New York Times, us lefties, do not say, well, Zimmerman was trying to do a good thing protecting the neighborhood, he just got the wrong kid. Because we understand that Trayvon Martin had nothing to do with whatever criminals might be in that neighborhood. He was just a kid eating candy and then he is dead. He's been shot dead. No one would dare make that argument. No one in the New York Times would dare make that argument. And they should not, because it's a racist argument. But coming to the drone survivors, this is precisely what Scott Shane says. He says it's morally okay that 20% of the dead had nothing to do with anything because, you know, the US was trying to do a good thing after all. And Scott Shane can make such a racist, Islamophobic in particular, argument because the law actually makes such a racist argument. I think there's incredible racist potential in international law. The law talks about collateral damage. The law works by one of the principles of law is proportionality, which is precisely about percentages. It's about ratios. And ratios do something very interesting. So in the numerator, you have the number of people killed, right? Civilians killed. So, for example, if you've killed 100 people and 20 of them happen to be innocent, that's 20%, and that's within Shane's limit, right? And then let's say you kill 200 people and 40 of them turn out to be innocent, you're still at 20%, and you're still within the limit. So actually what happens is as you kill more and more people, you get to kill more and more innocents too. That's how ratios work. That's how percentages work. The more destruction you cause, the more destruction you are allowed to cause. So the best the law can offer is a kind of patronizing refuge, I think. A pity that only works by distinguishing good Muslims from bad Muslims and saying, don't kill too many of the good ones. And maybe in the world that we live, we need that kind of law as a strategy, and it's useful for lawyers to deploy it. But I think as a broader discussion in the American discourse, it's an astounding failure of the American ethical imagination. And at this point you might say that's all very well, but we're not in war in the United States. In Pakistan we're actually at war. Well, first of all, it's not a declared war. In the United States we do have a war on drugs. So either we start thinking and being morally okay with the number of people who get killed along the way in this war on drugs, or we start questioning the innocents that are being killed in Pakistan. To do any less is to be completely hypocritical. The second point I want to make is that this is not a war against another state. It's a war on terror. It's a war on an emotion. It's entirely boundaryless. And we know that in this war, even American citizens can be killed, as we know with Anwar al-Awlaki's son. We know that our rights are being curtailed in the name of this war. We also know that Muslims, not accidentally, are being targeted and entrapped in the United States through this war. So the inside-outside distinction around this war doesn't exactly work. And in fact, I would say the war is not a great term to understand what is happening. I think currently what we have is a particular racist Islamophobic order that crystallizes in certain places as war. But it's the Islamophobic logic that now legitimizes this particular form of this particular racist order. So I just want to, I'm being told to close up, so I'm just going to close up. I want to say, Pakistanis in the tribal areas are being subject to an intense dehumanization, especially and also through language, right, and through numbers. So that when a Georgetown professor can refer to a toddler as terror spawn, as has happened, and their mothers as terror mamas, as has happened, that violation of their humanity is a prelude to their bodily annihilation. I think I'll just stop there, and we can pick up during the Q&A. Thank you.
After Madiha Tahir, Ellie Bolton, who was on the steering committee of communities in support of the Khalil Gibran International Academy, and she's currently active in Jews Say No and the Jews Against Islamophobia Coalition. I've had an occasion to work with Ellie in the work that they've done in two very important articles that have appeared on Alternet. Follow the Money from Islamophobia to Israel Right and Wrong, or which you'll discuss tonight, and how the Jewish establishment's litmus test on Israel fuels anti-Muslim bigotry.
I'm going to talk about Follow the Money from Islamophobia to Israel Right or Wrong, which is an article that Donna Neville and I, published about 2 months ago in Alternet. I also want to thank Abdeen, who was the person who told us when we started working in this general area that one thing we should definitely do is follow the money. Many of you have gotten a handout, and I'm going to be talking a bit about a few examples of what's on the handout, so that might be useful for you if you have it to refer to it. The article uses as a framework some of the research from the Center for American Progress's 2011 report, Fear, Inc., The Roots of the Islamophobic Network in America, which is an excellent report which I'd encourage all of you to read. You can download it on the internet. At the same time, it has one of the almost classic limits of liberal and mainstream analyses, which is that it talks about Islamophobia up to the point where the obvious next step is to talk about Israel, but it stops there, and it doesn't do that. So while CAP, the Center for American Progress, found an Islamophobia network in America, our research strengthened the work that other people that were doing and focused on a Money Islamophobia Israel network. And we're talking about a lot of people for whom the hard right Israel politics complements their Islamophobia. And that's a very important. CAP found that there were 7 funders that gave between the years 2001 to 2009 $42.9 million to just 8 groups that were led by a bunch of anti-Muslim ideologues. And there's a list of those on one side of your handout. I'm just going to give a couple of examples with highlighting the links to Israel. Frank Gaffney is somebody who thinks that Muslims are trying to take over the United States, and he's also a former Assistant Secretary of Defense. He served as a contributing expert to an Israeli research institute that reflects the hardline Likud policy on Israeli security. Stephen Emerson believes in the clash of civilizations between Islam and the West. He runs a group that provides terrorism-related training to private security guards and to government and military security personnel. The Jerusalem Post described his early career as having close ties to Israeli intelligence. Bridget Gabriel is a Christian Lebanese Muslim who runs a group called Act for America. They work with state governments to pass legislation to stop the imaginary threat to the United States of Sharia law. In her speeches, she said, the difference between Israel and the Arab world is a difference between civilization and barbarism. Now, as Deepa said before, these folks are not fringe, and they have a tremendous impact on U.S. both domestic and foreign policy. They provide the so-called facts, what we would call disinformation, to those within and outside the United States, in and outside the government rather, and as well as a conceptual framework that's both Islamophobic and Israel right or wrong. So Donna and I reviewed the 2001 to 2010 federal 990 forms of the 7 foundations, the 7 leading funders of Islamophobia, and what we were looking for was what their connection was to hard-right pro-Israel groups. Now, CAP had found that the 3 largest funders of these groups had given the majority of the money of this $42.9 million to the anti-Muslim ideologues. Now, these were groups that we consider connected to white Protestant nation, the Bradley Foundation, the Scaife Foundations, and Donors Capital. The other 4 funders, which they considered the main funders of the Islamophobia network, were what we call the Jewish funders. They had ties with the organized Jewish community. They mentioned Israel or Jewish issues in their mission statement. Their principals were affiliated with Jewish organizations, and most of them funded widely Jewish groups of different kinds. Now, of these groups, these 4 groups, 3 have been affiliated with organizations with hard right Israel politics. The 4th one, the Berry Foundation, is kind of an outlier in certain ways, and their board chair was connected with the group that supports religious pluralism. But 3 of the 4 Jewish funders, again, not considering the Berry Foundation, fund Israeli settlements. And if you look at the article or look at the handout, you'll see that the amounts that they give to the settlements are not that large. But you have to keep in mind that these relatively small amounts are only supplementing the huge amounts that the Israeli government gives in both direct and indirect aid. Let me just give you a couple of quick examples. 3 of these Jewish funders back the New York-based Central Fund of Israel, who in turn backs a West Bank settlement whose rabbi says it's permissible to kill anyone who, quote, weakens the kingdom, as well as Gentile babies so they don't grow up to be like their evil parents. 2 of the funders also back Ariel, a West Bank settlement of about 19,000 people, which is seen generally as an indisputable part of Israel. Okay, now 6 of the 7 funders fund groups that fall into 3 general categories: Hasbara, or the Israeli propaganda groups, neoconservative hawks, and Christian Zionists. And we're going to discuss only a few of them, and I should say also that in the article we discuss only a few of the many groups that we could have traced in terms of following the money. Now, 2 key points in terms of this group. One is that these different players here overlap, so that they become a part of this Money Islamophobia Israel network. Several of the groups have on their boards or in their speakers bureau 1 or more of the people who were in the anti-Islam ideologues who were part of the Islamophobia network in America. Several of the groups also have on their board or as a founder 1 or more of the foundation principles, so that there's a connection in many different ways. The second important point is that these groups are part of the organized Jewish community, and that's, I think, very important to consider. Camera, which works very hard to shut down any kind of criticism of Israel, and the Zionist Organization of America, which is a big supporter of Pamela Geller, who recently has put up signs and people are familiar with her. They are part of the JCRC, the Jewish Community Relations Councils, in the communities in which they live. This is where all the mainstream Jewish groups in a community connect with. Similarly, the David Project, which is another Hasbara group, is a partner agency of Hillel, which some of you will know. It's on about 500 universities and colleges around the country. Now, I just want to mention a couple of the strategies that have been taken by these Hasbara groups. One is monitoring and trying to shape media coverage on Israel. A couple of examples. A group called the Israel Project offers resources presenting a pro-Israel, anti-Palestinian narrative to policymakers, legislatures, and so on. They also support comments by Newt Gingrich and Michelle Bachmann about the, quote, Palestinian culture of hate. Their board of advisors currently includes 16 senators and 22 congressional representatives. Other groups are doing, and there's overlap of course, are engaged in legal challenges, attempts to silence critics of Israeli policies. The Institute for Jewish and Community Research, for example, documents what it calls anti-Israelism, which it defines as anti-Semitism, and is engaged in a suit with the U.S. Education Department Office of Civil Rights investigation into whether, by ignoring campus speech critical of Israel or Zionism, UC Santa Cruz administrators were creating a hostile climate for Jewish people on the campus. A second category here, and let me just go quickly through, there's the Jewish think tanks that provide a home for Jewish neoconservatives. There's a Jewish Policy Center, which shares a director and some of its key board members with the Republican Jewish Coalition, which has worked closely with Sheldon Adelson to try to get votes in Israel for Romney. The Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, or JINSA, believes, of course, in the class of civilization, and they see, as these other groups do, that Israel is a buffer against what they would claim is unassimilated and unassimilable Muslims. They bring U.S. cadets, midshipmen, retired generals, and admirals to Israel so they can learn the Israeli perspective that JINSA sees as something that will be of ongoing concern to American military planners for the foreseeable future. Third category is Christian Zionists, who primarily value Jews and Israel in terms of how it will affect the end-time battle in Israel for the second coming of Christ. The main group there, the Christians United for Israel, caps its Nights to Honor Israel with a big donation to the local Jewish Federation and sometimes to an Israeli settlement as well. One of the groups that I've mentioned, the foundation, the Russell Berry Foundation, doesn't fund the groups that I've mentioned above and also supports groups that back pluralism and international conflict monitoring. But that's only part of their story. They also back Birthright, which gives, maybe some of you have gone at, which gives free tours for Jewish youth to Israel, and is part of the fight for kind of the political minds of young Jews. This also gets support of over $100 million each, both from Sheldon Adelson and from the Israeli government. The last group is American Friends of Riot Institute, which Berry supports. It's an Israeli national security think tank, and they help frame the narrative that defines nearly all criticism of Israeli policies as part of a, quote, delegitimization campaign. So they're very important for us to know about. Okay, what have we learned from following the money? We've been able to translate into dollar figures two overlapping ideologies, one vehemently anti-Muslim and anti-Arab, the other Israel right or wrong. We've provided hard data to show that there is an Islamophobia Israel money network. The network matters, as in a lot of ways, as Deepa has talked about, in part because of its impact on and strong relationship with state policies and institutions. In addition to furthering a rapidly anti-Muslim climate, its members help bolster the state-sponsored Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian policies of the U.S. government.
And then lastly, we will have Kazi Fawzia, who's a designer and seamstress in a retail Saudi shop in Jamaica, Queens. And she's been a founder of Drum since 2009, fighting for better rights as an undocumented Muslim immigrant worker. In Bangladesh, Kazi was a member of a street vendors union, a community theater group, and organizer for free community health clinics, and taught young children from the slums. There will be a translator for Ms. Fawzia, and his name is Fahad Ahmed, who is sitting at the end, who's the legal and policy director of Drum.
Hello, good evening. So when I start, I want to just correct something. My mother tell me I'm the founder of DAM. I'm not founder of DAM. I'm a community and worker organizer. Munami Maulik is a founder of DAM. So So, and I'm going to do my speech Hindi, and Fahad going to translate for me because my language access is not that type of good. So, the first thing here is a e-book lane.
So I, as a community member and as somebody that comes from a third world country, and based on my own life experiences and the things that I have seen and experienced in my own life, I'd like to speak more so from that perspective.
So, मुझे जो लगती है इस्लामोफोबिया जो है ये कोई नया चीज़ नहीं है, ये जो सिस्टम है कैपिटलिज्म का जो सिस्टम है इसको कायम रखने के लिए एक टेक्निक है.
So from my perspective, Islamophobia is actually not something that's completely new and unique. It is something that is an extension of keeping capitalism in place and the expansion of capitalism.
आपका ऑर्गेनाइजेशन जिन्होंने
So as Jews Against Islamophobia is the host of this program, we know the long history of anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish sentiment that existed in Europe, and how that played into capitalism. And there was a concerted effort to minimize, exterminate, and suppress that history, that legacy.
एंड दूसरा ग्रुप जो है वो है ब्लैक कम्युनिटी जो.
And then similarly, we also see the long history of anti-black racism from its earliest manifestations to now, that they were targeted in very extreme ways as well, and that is also a continuation of that same legacy.
एंड तीसरा कैपिटलिज्म सिस्टम को कायम रखने.
And so then the third obstacle that capitalism saw was the rise of communism, and that became a protracted struggle and became the identified threat for a long period of time until that was neutralized. And then they sought for the next target, and they identified Muslims and Islam.
So हम लोग जो यहाँ पे रहने वाला जो मुस्लिम.
So after for the communities that have grown up, that live here in the U.S., Muslim communities, wherever they come from, sometimes this picture gets painted that, after 9/11, there was this thing, Islamophobia, that really sort of came to the forefront. And then that, we had to go and hunt down Osama bin Laden, we had to go hunt down Saddam Hussein. But what gets ignored is that the American government created these people, funded these people, supported these people, and then sort of, targeted them, and we kind of got screwed in both cases.
You can say that.
Yeah, and Deepa mentioned किया the good Muslim or bad Muslim. Islamophobia में भी division है, good Muslim or bad Muslim.
And so we see this manifestation, as Deepa mentioned earlier, of good Muslim, bad Muslim. If it was just about religiosity, if you use that standard, it doesn't work, because Saudi Arabia ends up being a good Muslim. And then, Afghanistan, Iraq, dissident communities, Muslims living here end up being the bad Muslims.
ठीक इस तरह से आप जो Zionist यहाँ पर.
So ideology and identity, a lot of it, identity in particular, can be passed, whether it is around issues of Israel, even issues of Zionism. If it, as long as it supports the larger agenda, it will be utilized for its own purposes. If there is a form of Zionism that may oppose the agenda, then there maybe may not. So similarly, we see with black communities, there's this division of good black people, bad black people, good Muslim, bad Muslim, issues on class. So a lot of it should be understood in how it relates to the larger agenda that's in play. I'll just take a couple of minutes to highlight a few things. It's important to understand the importance of state violence as being the central sort of harbinger of Islamophobia. That without the condoning, the complicity of state violence, a lot of the other privatized forms of Islamophobia would not be able to thrive. And we can see this, that if you really think about 9/11, there were some very brutal attacks that happened immediately after that as sort of, backlash. But if we really think about it, 3,000 people died in 9/11. The number of attacks were comparatively not that big. But if you think about the state violence, there was 1,200 men that were picked up out of their homes, out of their workplaces, out of everywhere, and disappeared into the middle of the night. And most of them ended up being deported. And we have to be very careful that when we talk about Islamophobia, that we do not excuse or invisibilize the state violence of it. And what's interesting is that it's almost 7, 8 years later that we really start to see the rise of the privatized Islamophobia. And that's because it germinated and really, really started to grow at a time that there was state violence taking place in communities here through the surveillance, through the entrapments, through the policing, and there's wars taking on abroad. And that the state sort of official, whether they say it or not, by their acts, by the wars, by the policing, they identified Muslims as an enemy. That allowed these private forms of it to really start to grow much, much faster. That's not to say that they didn't exist before, that they weren't doing stuff before, but it created the environment for them to grow.
No, not,
I wanted to come in.
She wants to comment, yes.
Okay. So on the question of liberal Islamophobia, I think, we can tell the blatant Islamophobia. We can tell the kind of people that Ellie talks about who say that Muslims are conspiring to take over the United States or they've infiltrated the government and so on and so forth. But it's much harder to identify and to critique liberal Islamophobia. And in essence, what it is the use of liberal ideas in order to advance a racist politics, right? So ideas like human rights, democracy, free speech, women's rights, and so on, as a way to construct an us versus them, where we get these things, and they're just too barbaric to actually get it, so let's go bring it to them in the form of a new white man's burden. But it's not called white man's burden, because it's Barack Obama who's actually selling that in the most sophisticated language that you can think of. And so it becomes something else. It becomes a very new way of using this language through the personage of Barack Obama. And the quote I was looking for is this. Huntington basically distinguishes between us and them in the following way. He says, Western ideas of individualism, liberalism, constitutionalism, human rights, equality, liberty, the rule of law, democracy, free markets, the separation of church and state often have little resonance in Islamic societies, apparently. Right? Maybe Huntington should have sent a memo to the people who have led the Arab uprisings for democracy, human rights, free speech, and so on, but apparently the memo didn't reach, and they went ahead and fought for these things anyway. But I think this comes up again and again by the most, I think, sometimes well-intentioned people, and I want to speak to what was said earlier, which is, I wrote a piece, 5, 6 years ago about Islamophobia on the left in relation to the Danish cartoon controversy. Because the way in which that was defended is these barbaric people don't appreciate our finely tuned appreciation of free speech. Never considering, of course, that cartoons, Hollywood, cultural representations that are racist always come out of a system of violence against a whole load of people. So these are not cultural artifacts that exist outside of a larger society. It would be akin to the kind of cartoons that were used against Jews back during the Nazi era. You look at them and you compare them. I teach a class on this, and we compare some of these cartoons, and they're remarkably similar. The kinds of attitudes, the kind of images, and so on and so forth that take place. And this comes up again and again. It did again after the September 11th Benghazi attacks, and then the protests that spread around the world. Again, it was narrowed down to saying that this is just about the film Innocence of Muslims. Never mind, of course, that people in Pakistan may be angry about the drone strikes. Never mind that in Egypt, you actually look at some of the other non-US media, they show protesters carrying signs saying no to the IMF deal. So there are more complex reasons, and yet it gets reduced to this film, and these people just can't understand our finely tuned value of free speech. And so that's liberal Islamophobia. And women actually come into this picture in a very direct way, because it's about, again, our appreciation of feminism. Suddenly, people who are sexist become transformed into feminists as a way to justify what they want to do. I mean, Bush, for instance, the most unfeminist person you can think of, marshals these arguments. Do you remember the time when he was on the campaign trail and he smacks Laura Bush on the backside? This is like a throwback to the 1950s, right? And here's the man who, once he's elected, uses this. But just very quickly on this question, this strategy of presenting Muslim women as victims is used very consciously by their side. An expose by WikiLeaks actually shows that the CIA's Red Cell had an entire document showing how the way in which to win support, flagging support for the Afghan war in Europe, was to drum up the sympathy card related to Afghan women, and in particular in France, use this as a way to cement and to solidify support for the Afghan war. Last thing I'll say is that I think the way I talk about this question when people ask me this is, look, women are still oppressed everywhere, right? We face sexual violence, we face physical violence, and so on. It just looks different in different countries. And part of what the slut walk movement, which began in Toronto, not in Saudi Arabia, was about is precisely this way in which violence against women and the dehumanization and the sexualization of women is an international issue. And it started a process of international dialogue and solidarity around this question. I think that's how we need to think about this.
Well, I just want to thank our fabulous panelists and moderator one more time. I mean, so inspiring and insightful, and I think most important, useful, because I know that many of us in this room are already activists on this issue, and I hope that many more of you will be inspired to join into some of the campaigns that are happening around this so that we can do this organizing and this education and all this work that needs to be done.